It began with a body found in a locked room. No struggle, no weapon, no sign of a break-in. The police called it an accident. But Sherlock Holmes took one look and disagreed. There was a bruise, faint, almost invisible, but not where it should have been. And in that single mark, he saw the entire crime unfold in reverse. Because sometimes the truth doesn't hide in what's there, it hides in what's wrong. Each detail, each shadow, each misplaced mark whispered the same message. This wasn't fate, it was murder. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this sharpen your instincts, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because every week, another strange case from Baker Street awaits. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit back, and prepare to think like Holmes himself. This is Sherlock Holmes and the Bruise in the Wrong Place. Chapter 1. The Bruise in the Wrong Place. It was one of those singularly crisp November mornings that made London appear almost honest in its damp austerity. The fog, though reluctant, had receded somewhat, and the gas lamps stood pale and mute like watchers of a quiet truce. I had the fire going in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, and the crackling of the coals was the only competition to the rustle of the Times in my hand. Holmes sat opposite, cross-legged in the armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes not on me but on the slipper at his feet, within which, as always, he kept his tobacco. We had not had a case in nearly a week, an unusually long silence for Holmes, and one which always heralded either violin improvisations of Wagnerian length or a return to the chemical stains that mottled our table. On this particular morning, however, Holmes had not touched his violin nor his reagents. He was simply waiting, which I had learned by now was no idle activity for him. It came, inevitably, as it always did, with a knock on the downstairs door-light, deliberate and muffled by the thick wooden panels. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed, soft and brisk, and then came the tap at our own door. "A visitor, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her expression giving away the fact that this was no ordinary caller. "Show them in," Holmes replied without shifting his gaze. The woman who entered was young I would have said, with a sharp contrast between the elegance of her bearing and the panic that shimmered behind her eyes. She wore a bottle-green coat, fastened with one broken button, and her gloves were torn at the seams, despite the quality of the leather. Her face was pale and drawn, though she stood with grace, her spine held straight by what I imagined was years of societal training. "I am Miss Lydia Fernmore," she said, with the ghost of a curtsy. "I've come about my sister, Eleanor." "Please, sit," Holmes gestured, his tone softening slightly. "Dr. Watson and I are entirely at your disposal. Begin wherever it makes the least sense." Miss Fernmore blinked, startled, but Holmes often began in such ways. It jolted people into honesty. "My sister is dead," she said plainly, after a pause. "But something is wrong, terribly wrong, with the way she died." Holmes sat forward slightly, his eyes gleaming. "Go on." "She was found 2 nights ago at our family estate near Richmond. In the music room. A fall, they said. She had struck the back of her head on the edge of the piano. That is what the local doctor believes, and the police are satisfied. They found no sign of forced entry, no sign of violence, ... But you are not satisfied," Holmes finished for her. "No," she said, her voice lowering. Because of the bruise. Holmes' eyes narrowed. What bruise? A small one, she said. High on her right forearm. It was shaped like a thumbprint, almost as if someone had seized her in haste, violently. But it made no sense. There was no other mark. And if she fell backwards, why would the bruise be there? It was in the wrong place. At this, Holmes rose from his chair as though a string had been pulled. He went to the window and looked out toward the fog-strewn street. You understand? Miss Fernmore, he said slowly, that many would call such a detail trivial. I know, she whispered. But Eleanor, she was frightened in the days before. She had confided nothing, but she had changed. She stopped attending recitals. She said very little. I believe someone meant her harm. Holmes turned, his eyes sharp. Was your sister wealthy? She had her own modest inheritance, yes. Was she involved romantically with anyone? Miss Fernmore hesitated. She had suitors, of course. One in particular had been persistent, Mr. Archer Wynne. My father disapproved of him. Holmes caught that pause. And your father? Is he living? He died last year. My Uncle Hugh Fernmore's the head of the family now. He and Eleanor quarreled often about the estate. Holmes returned to his chair and steepled his fingers once more. A bruise in the wrong place, he murmured. Curious, indeed. Dr. Watson, do you recall the Brentford drowning? Vividly, I said. The man was found face down in 2 feet of water, yet with mud caked under his fingernails and no water in his lungs. A most instructive contradiction. Precisely. Contradictions are the great clarifiers of truth, Holmes said, then turned to our guest. Miss Fernmore, would it be possible to see your sister's body? She flushed slightly. Yes, it is being held in the family chapel for burial on Thursday. You may see it if you come today. And the police? They have closed the matter. There is no official investigation. Good, Holmes said. Then we shan't be in their way. He stood, brushing an imaginary speck of ash from his sleeve. Come, Watson. I believe we must pay a visit to the late Miss Eleanor Fernmore. I hoped you would say that, Lydia whispered. I know it is foolish, but I could not bear to leave it alone. Not when something feels so wrong. Holmes gave her a look I had seen only a few times, a rare fusion of warmth and ferocity. Miss Fernmore, he said, you did not bring me a foolish detail. You brought me a paradox. And that, I assure you, is a far rarer thing than a corpse. As we gathered our coats, I could not help but feel that something peculiar waited in the halls of the Fernmore, a state something that would not yield easily to logic, but that, in the end, would be forced to kneel before Holmes' relentless pursuit of truth. We left Baker Street with the cold in our lungs, but something stranger and colder still ahead. A bruise in the wrong place. It was a small thing, but as Holmes had once told me, the smallest displacement in the pattern, Watson, is where the murderer leaves his thumbprint. Chapter 2. A house where music had died. The train to Richmond moved with a sluggish grace, its windows blurring the gray countryside into smears of ash and slate. Holmes, as usual, had occupied the corner seat, his long form draped with casual elegance, eyes closed but never asleep. I sat across from him, notebook in hand, though I had scarcely written a word since we departed Baker Street. The name Eleanor Fernmore echoed in my mind, tethered always to the curious detail of the misplaced bruise. Holmes had not spoken for some time. His only remark, as we boarded, had been a cryptic one. The fall that does not fall often carries the weight of intent. He offered no elaboration. Outside, the chill deepened, and the clouds threatened snow. Fernmore House stood apart from the village, set behind a row of skeletal elms that groaned faintly in the wind. It was a broad, stony residence of Georgian design, handsome but cold in its symmetry, the kind of place that seemed built not to shelter warmth but to contain it. Lydia led us through a gravel path, her boots crunching faintly in the hush. The windows of the house were shuttered on the upper floor, and I could not help but notice the distinct absence of birdsong or servants. We were greeted not by household staff, but by the butler, an aged, sharp-eyed fellow named Price, who showed no sign of surprise at our arrival. Holmes gave him a polite nod but observed him closely, as he always did when encountering long-service retainers. We were led first to the drawing-room, a solemn chamber filled with damask chairs and portraits of solemn ancestors whose eyes followed us with unreadable judgment. Lydia sat by the hearth, her hands trembling only slightly as she poured tea. Holmes refused it with a murmured thanks and wandered the room, pausing at the shelves of music scores. "Eleanor played, I take it?" he asked, plucking a volume marked "Batch." "Well-tempered." Lydia nodded. "Beautifully. The piano was her refuge after our father died. She would sit for hours, lost in it." Holmes returned the score gently to its place. "And the room in which she was found, the music room, it remains undisturbed?" "Yes," Lydia said. "Uncle Hugh insisted it be kept closed until after the funeral. He said it was a matter of family dignity." Holmes arched an eyebrow at that, but made no comment. Uncle Hugh arrived soon after, announced not by the butler, but by the subtle hush that fell when he entered. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver-threaded hair and a face carved into stern lines. There was an air about him of firm control, like a door bolted from within. "You are the consulting detective," he said without preamble. "I am Sherlock Holmes, yes. And this is Dr. Watson." "I understand Lydia invited you," Hugh said, glancing at his niece. "I trust you will not interfere with the family's mourning." Holmes smiled slightly. "I am here at Miss Fernmore's request. My work is observation, not disruption." "Very well," the man said, folding his arms. "But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, my brother's death was difficult enough. I will not have this house turned into a circus." Holmes merely inclined his head and turned away, leaving the statement to hang unanswered. Holmes leaned in. "A prior injury," he said. "Weeks old, perhaps more. She had been grabbed in the same place before." I looked to Lydia, who stared at the portrait, eyes wide. I never noticed that," she whispered. "She never told me she was hurt." Holmes turned slowly from the photograph. "Did she ever fall? Have an accident?" "Not that I recall," she replied. But she had grown quieter lately. We all assumed it was grief. Holmes said nothing, but I saw something shift in his expiation, a piece falling closer to its place in the great unseen puzzle. We moved next into the small adjoining study, a room filled with narrow drawers and pigeonholes of correspondence. Holmes rifled through them quickly, fingers deft and precise. He paused only once, saw a half-torn envelope addressed to Eleanor, with no return name, only the initials A.W. The paper inside was missing. Holmes tucked the envelope into his coat. "I shall wish to speak with Mr. Archer Wintle sooner rather than later," he said. "If this was from him, he has more to answer for than poor courtship." Lydia nodded slowly. "He was persistent," she said, "but never violent, least not in front of me." Holmes glanced at her. Many men perform differently when watched. It was growing late, and the house had quieted further. Even the creaks of settling wood seemed hesitant. Holmes led us back into the hall and paused by the great staircase. "You mentioned," he said to Lydia, "that Eleanor and your uncle quarreled over the estate. Was there a change to the will?" Lydia hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Yes," she said. "My father's original will split the estate equally between Eleanor and myself. But last spring, Uncle Hugh had the terms adjusted, somehow persuading the solicitor that our father's final intentions had not been fully understood. Now Eleanor's share would pass to the Fernmore Trust, overseen by Uncle Hugh." Holmes gave a faint whistle. "And did your sister contest this?" "She was furious," Lydia said. "She wrote to the family solicitor, but I never heard what came of it." Holmes nodded once, his thoughts deepening like a well. "Greed," he said softly, "is a sharper blade than most suspect, but it often cuts in strange directions." With that, he turned and made his way back toward the guest rooms, where he and I would retire for the night. Before he disappeared around the corner, I heard him mutter, "A bruise seen twice, a letter gone missing, and a house full of silence." I caught up to him just before the door closed. "You're close, aren't you?" I asked. He didn't look at me, but there was something resolute in his voice. "Closer than they realize, but not close enough to be safe not yet." Chapter 5. The man with gloves in his pocket the following morning dawned with a grim stillness, as though the house itself had no interest in welcoming the day. The sky beyond the frosted windows of Fernmore House was a uniform gray, thick with unfallen snow. Holmes rose early, well before breakfast, and I found him seated in the library by the time I descended. He had already lit a fire and was absorbed in a small leather-bound ledger, flipping its pages with swift precision. "The household accounts," he said without looking up. "Always revealing. People believe numbers to be dull, Watson, but numbers rarely lie. Only men do." I poured myself a cup of coffee from the tray Mrs. Price had left and sat beside him. "And what do the numbers say?" I asked. Holmes tapped a page. 2 purchases of ladies' gloves in October. Both expensive. Yet neither Lydia nor Eleanor wore them, according to Price. He snapped the book shut. "Which means someone was hiding their touch, or protecting it." After a silent meal shared with Lydia, Uncle Hugh and Frederick claiming business in town, Holmes expressed his wish to walk the grounds. Lydia joined us, wrapped in a long gray cloak, her face pale but composed. The sky threatened snow but held back. As we strolled down the frosted path toward the rose garden, Holmes paused and gestured to the small gardener's shed nestled among the hedges. "Is it locked?" he asked. Lydia shook her head. "No one uses it this time of year." Holmes entered with care. The inside was dusty, filled with tools and coiled twine, and the scent of damp earth lingered in the walls. In one corner, beneath a crate of old watering cans, he uncovered a pair of scuffed men's gloves, still damp with recent wear. "The fingers," he said, holding one up, "are stained. Ink, perhaps, or soot." We returned to the house shortly after, and Holmes asked Lydia to arrange for us to speak privately with Price, the butler. The old man arrived promptly in the study, composed and courteous. "Mr. Price," Holmes began, "how long have you been with the Fernmore family?" 37 years, sir," the man replied without hesitation. "Since before Miss Lydia and Miss Eleanor were born." Holmes nodded. "You must have known their father well." Price's expression softened slightly. "He was a good man, fair and precise." "The girls meant everything to him." "And Mr. Hugh?" Holmes asked. A long pause followed. "He is different," Price said carefully. "Efficient, stern, but loyal in his way." Holmes leaned back in the chair. "Tell me, Price, do you recall anyone visiting the house the day before Miss Eleanor's death?" The butler's gaze flicked, just for a moment, toward the window. "Only Mr. Wintle," he said. "He came that afternoon. Miss Eleanor met him in the west drawing-room. For how long? Perhaps 20 minutes. Then he left, quickly." After Price departed, Holmes stood in the middle of the study, silent for a full minute. "Watson," he said at last, "there are too many shadows in this house for the truth to remain hidden much longer." He crossed to the fireplace, where the embers had burned low. "A man comes in secret. He meets a woman who fears him. She bears an old bruise, already fading. Then, soon after, she dies of a fall that does not match the room." He turned to me. "There are only so many places left for the truth to hide." That afternoon, at Holmes' insistence, we took a hired trap into the village to speak with the family solicitor, Mr. Alfred Weucombe, a portly man with a florid face and a nervous manner. We found him in his office above the apothecary, poring over ledgers and tapping his inkwell. Holmes introduced himself, and Weucombe's eyes widened. Yes, of course. Sherlock Holmes. I had heard you were at Fernmore." Holmes wasted no time. "You amended the late Mr. Fernmore's will at the request of his brother." Weucombe swallowed hard, with great reluctance. It was a complicated matter. Hugh Fernmore presented a letter from the deceased dated and signed stating his wish that his estate be consolidated under the family trust to prevent division of assets. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And you confirmed the handwriting?" "It resembled his style," Weucombe admitted, "but Eleanor contested it. She claimed the letter was forged." "And what happened to her complaint?" "I sent word to a handwriting expert, but before anything could come of it, she was dead." Holmes finished. We returned to Fernmore as the sky finally gave up its resistance and released the first flurries of snow. Holmes was quiet for most of the ride, his gloved fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Someone," he murmured, "has been playing a long game. And Eleanor, poor Eleanor, was too proud to scream until it was too late." Back in the house, the lamps had been lit early against the growing storm. Miss Calder greeted us in the hall with a forced smile. "You look like you've seen ghosts," she said. Holmes simply stared at her. "Not yet," he replied, "but they do seem to gather here, don't they?" She said nothing more and retreated up the stairs. That night, as Holmes and I sat once more before the fire, he opened his notebook and made a series of crisp notations. "Watson," he said quietly, "if a man wears gloves when no others do, hides letters, and alters a will, we might call him a scoundrel. But if he does all three and a woman ends up dead, we must call him something worse." I leaned forward. "You think Hugh is our man?" Holmes gave a weary smile. I think he is not alone. And it is the accomplice. Watson, the accomplice, always speaks first. Chapter 6. The Whisper. Beneath the door, the next morning arrived, with a hush laid thick over the house, as if the falling snow had blanketed more than just the lawn and rooftop. Fernmore House, always restrained, now felt entirely sealed from the world outside. Holmes rose early again, and I found him by the drawing-room window, his fingers tracing the condensation on the glass. He didn't turn as I entered, merely spoke in a quiet voice. "They are afraid, Watson. The silence in this house is no longer the quiet of grief, is the stillness of people waiting to see if someone else will speak first." I joined him at the window. Outside, the grounds were muted in white. No footprints had broken the snow since nightfall. "What's our next move?" I asked. Holmes tapped the sill lightly. "Miss Calder. Her story is too neat, too convenient. She hovers at the edges of every conversation, yet claims to know nothing. And people who know nothing always speak in prepared phrases." After breakfast, Holmes asked Lydia if we might speak with Miss Calder alone. Lydia seemed hesitant but agreed, sending a maid to fetch the companion. We met her in the west drawing-room, where she stood already waiting near the window, arms folded, a thick shawl wrapped tightly about her narrow shoulders. "Another round of questions, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, with that same brittle smile. "Have I not already told you everything I know?" Holmes returned the smile politely. "People always say that when they are about to recall something new." Miss Calder gave a soft snort but did not sit. Holmes moved slowly through the room, as if admiring the decor. "You were very fond of Miss Eleanor, were you not?" he said. "Of course. She was kind to me, generous. Did you know about the letter she received from Mr. Wintle the week she died?" The smile faltered slightly. "No, I don't believe so." Holmes turned to face her fully. "And yet you mentioned to Lydia 2 nights ago that Eleanor had been upset by something Mr. Wintle said to her. That would suggest you knew of the letter, or perhaps heard part of the conversation yourself." There was a flicker of hesitation, quickly masked. "She told me a little, that's all, after he left." Holmes stepped closer. "Then why did Price say you weren't even in the house that afternoon?" A pause, longer this time. "I went into the village briefly, but I returned shortly after. I may have overheard them speaking through the door." "Which door?" "The west drawing-room," she said softly. "I stood outside for a moment before coming in." Holmes looked down, then back at her. "And what did you hear?" Miss Calder's voice was barely above a whisper. "She was crying," she said. "You said you'd stop, and then she said something about the will. But that was all." Holmes glanced at me, then walked to the fireplace and stirred the cold ashes. "Miss Calder," he said, his tone still gentle, "why have you lied about your whereabouts?" She swallowed, the skin around her eyes tightening. "Because I thought it would bring scandal. I heard more than I admitted. I saw Mr. Wintle push her, not hard but enough to make her stumble. She didn't fall then, but it frightened me. I told myself it was nothing." Holmes nodded slowly. "And afterward?" "I left the room. I said nothing. I thought if she was unharmed, perhaps it would pass." Her voice broke. "But then she was dead, and I thought if anyone knew I'd seen them, they would think I was part of it." Holmes didn't reply for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Calder, you must write down exactly what you saw and heard. Every word." I believe your memory may prove more important than you realize. She nodded and quietly left the room. When the door closed behind her, Holmes looked to me. Wintel's involvement deepens, but I still feel the heavy presence of another hand in all this, Uncle Hugh, I asked. Holmes nodded. Yes, Calder may have seen Wintel push Eleanor, but she did not see her die. The final act, whatever it was, remains unseen. Which means it may not have been Wintel's hand that completed the deed. That afternoon, Holmes sent a telegram requesting that Wintel come to the house under the pretext of settling Eleanor's unfinished correspondence. The reply came swiftly. Wintel would arrive before dusk. Holmes used the intervening hours to inspect the house once again, moving with quiet intensity, tapping at walls, lifting rugs, measuring distances from room to room. He paused at the main staircase and asked me to walk slowly down the top steps while he crouched beside the banister, observing the angle. No, he murmured. The physics do not align. She could not have fallen backward from here and struck the piano. I nodded. Then she was moved, or led, Holmes replied. When Wintel arrived, he came bundled in a heavy coat and gloves, his mustache flecked with snow. He greeted Lydia coolly and offered his sympathies with a flatness that bordered on performative. Holmes greeted him warmly, offering tea and drawing him into the library. You knew Eleanor well, Holmes said conversationally. We were close, Wintel replied. But her family never approved. Hugh Fernmore considered me beneath them. And did you quarrel? Not often. There was tension, but nothing unusual. What of her state of mind before she died? She was troubled, Wintel admitted. But she wouldn't say why. She seemed afraid. Holmes leaned forward. Did you send her a letter before her death? A slight pause. I might have. I often did. And did that letter mention the will? Wintel's brow furrowed. I don't think so. Holmes smiled faintly. You seem to forget easily, Mr. Wintel. Yet Miss Calder remembers the moment Eleanor asked you to stop. Wintel's face darkened. She's lying, he snapped. I never touched Eleanor. But you did push her, Holmes said quietly. That we know. Wintel stood abruptly. I will not be accused. I loved her. If something happened to her, it was not by my hand. Holmes remained seated, watching him. Then prove it. Tell me where you were the night she died. Wintel hesitated, then shook his head. Alone, in my rooms. No one can verify it. He turned on his heel and left the house. Holmes exhaled and finally rose. There is guilt there, he said, but not the guilt of a murderer. His shame is real, but it's for his cowardice, not his crime. I looked at him. Then who? Holmes looked toward the stairs, his voice soft. The one who benefits most, Watson. The one who wears grief like a uniform and walks halls already measured for inheritance. But to trap him, we must let him believe he's already safe. Chapter 7. A curtain drawn twice. The snow had thickened by nightfall, and a pale hush lay heavy over the estate, muffling every step, every door, every breath. The lamps within Fernmore House burned low, casting elongated shadows that crept across the walls like silent witnesses. Holmes spent the evening in uncharacteristic stillness. Seated near the fireplace in the library, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze turned inward. I had come to recognize this mood, wealth, a coil of logic tightening behind his still expression. The quiet before the conclusion began to form. I said little, letting him work through the threads in his mind. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows. Never loud, only persistent, like something waiting to be let in. Shortly before 10, Holmes stood without a word and moved toward the hall. I followed, used to his sudden bursts of motion after hours of silence. He paused before the west corridor, where the yellow drawing room sat quiet behind its door. "Watson," he said softly, "do you recall the curtain behind Eleanor's armchair? The one drawn across the side window?" I nodded. "It was closed, wasn't it?" "Yes," he said. "But there are 2 rings missing from the curtain rod. 2 clean gaps where the fabric sags, as though it had been drawn and redrawn in haste." I frowned. "You think someone hid there?" "Someone watched," he replied. "Perhaps not the crime itself, but something that led to it. We have overlooked the oldest of all witnesses, the one who hides by standing still." Holmes entered the room and moved directly to the window, drawing the curtain fully back. The pane was clean, and beyond it, the snow-covered lawn reflected the orange glow of the house lamps. He gestured toward the sill. "Dust disturbed here, see? And a small scratch in the wood. Someone opened this recently." I stepped closer. The faint trace was unmistakable. Holmes turned, his eyes narrowed. "There is a tale the west drawing room wants to tell, but it is not its own. It is someone else's. Someone who stood here in silence and learned more than they were meant to." Before I could speak, a creak echoed in the hallway, soft, almost apologetic. Holmes froze, then stepped toward the door and opened it wide. Frederick Fernmore stood just beyond the threshold, his hands in his pockets, his expression faintly amused. "You do enjoy prowling at night, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I'm beginning to think you prefer ghosts to company." Holmes didn't smile. "Ghosts are often more cooperative." "And what has this particular ghost revealed?" "That it was watched," Holmes said, "by someone standing exactly where you are now." Frederick's expression did not change, but a stillness came over him. "You think I saw something?" "I think you saw everything," Holmes replied, and chose to say nothing. There was a long silence. Then Frederick stepped into the room slowly. "Very well," he said. "Yes, I watched, not that night, but the one before." He moved toward the window, gazing out over the dark lawn. "Eleanor was with Uncle Hugh. They were arguing. I didn't catch everything, but I heard enough to know it was about the will. She accused him of altering it, said she had proof. He laughed at her, said no one would believe her. Then he told her she'd better be careful what she said and where. He turned back to us. He sounded ... calm, but there was a threat beneath it. "Why didn't you speak?" I asked. "Because I have no proof either," he said. "And Uncle Hugh has a way of destroying those who challenge him. He's powerful, quietly so. He'd ruin me." Holmes nodded, as if he had expected this. "You feared for yourself. A common instinct, but a dangerous one. Still, what you've shared confirms what I suspected." "Which is?" Frederick asked. "That Eleanor never fell by accident. That her death was not only desired but necessary to someone." He turned away, the wheels in his mind already turning toward what came next. "Thank you for your honesty. It may yet help restore some of the honor this house has lost." After Frederick left, Holmes sat once more beside the window. "The net tightens Watson, we are no longer collecting clues, we are closing the circle. But there's still no proof, I said. Only suspicion and recollections. Holmes nodded. Then we must create proof, or rather, allow the guilty to reveal it themselves. Tomorrow, I shall ask Lydia to host a final gathering. Everyone in one room, and I shall do what predators hate most. I shall turn on the light. I looked at him. You think Hugh will falter? He won't falter, Holmes said quietly. But someone else will. The one who helped him. The one who knows what was done but hasn't the strength to bear the silence much longer. The fire crackled beside us. The wind murmured at the glass. And the snow continued to fall soft, steady, and relentless. In that cold, quiet hour, I realized the trap had already been set. All that remained was to see who stepped into it first. Chapter 8. The Gathering Before the Storm. The following day unfolded with a peculiar calm that settled over Fernmore House like the eye of a storm. The snow had ceased some time in the night, leaving the grounds blanketed in perfect white, undisturbed by any track or footprint. Within the walls of the estate, however, the stillness had taken on a new character, more watchful than peaceful, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Holmes rose early, his movements precise, his words clipped with quiet focus. He spoke with Lydia in the morning room, requesting her help in gathering everyone: Uncle Hugh, Frederick, Miss Calder, Price, even Mr. Wintle, if he could be summoned under the pretense of a memorial toast in Eleanor's name. Lydia agreed, without hesitation, her eyes steady, her voice firm. Whatever fear had once haunted her expression seemed now replaced with resolve. By the time evening fell, the drawing-room had been prepared. The fire was lit, casting a gentle warmth across the high walls. A decanter of port stood on the sideboard, glasses arranged beside it, untouched. Holmes stood near the hearth, his hands folded behind his back, eyes scanning every movement, every pause in conversation as the household gathered. Uncle Hugh arrived last, composed as ever, dressed impeccably in dark wool, a pale handkerchief tucked with careful precision into his breast pocket. He offered no protest at the gathering, only a thin smile and a quiet nod. "A fine idea, Lydia," he said. "We've not honored her properly. It is time." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, Mr. Fernmore, it is time." Lydia stood near the window, her hands folded before her, as Holmes began to speak. "We are gathered here," he said, his voice calm and clear, "not merely to remember Miss Eleanor Fernmore, but to honor the truth that she tried to leave behind. A truth hidden in bruises, in torn letters, in frightened silences. A truth we must now bring into the light." A ripple passed through the room. Uncle Hugh's eyes narrowed slightly. Wintle shifted where he stood, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Miss Calder stood rigid, as if bracing herself against a blow. Holmes took a step forward. On the evening of her death, Miss Eleanor was not alone. She was frightened, yes, but not unaware. She knew what was coming, and she had begun to resist. Holmes turned toward the fire, his voice softening. "You see, the final blow was not dealt in anger. It was dealt in fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing control. But there was a miscalculation." He looked around the room. The bruise was in the wrong place. A stunned silence followed. Uncle Hugh broke it with a tight laugh. "Really, Mr. Holmes? Must we indulge in such theatrics? Only when the truth hides behind them, Holmes replied. You altered the will, Mr. Fernmore. You forged your brother's letter. Eleanor found out and threatened to challenge it. You knew that if she succeeded, your hold over the estate would be weakened. This is absurd, Hugh said coldly. You have no evidence. No direct evidence, Holmes agreed, but a pattern and a motive, and the testimony of a man who heard you threaten her. Holmes gestured, and Frederick stepped forward slowly. His voice was quiet, but steady. I heard you in the west drawing room. You told her no one would believe her, that she should be careful where she walked. Hugh's expression didn't falter. My nephew is a dreamer, he said, and a coward. He resents my authority. Holmes turned then to Miss Calder. You saw Mr. Wintle push Eleanor, he said gently. But you didn't see what happened later. You saw nothing because you weren't in the house. But someone else was. Price, standing near the doorway, looked up sharply. Holmes continued. Price, you told us you were in your quarters, but your boots, the ones by the cellar stairs, were wet with snow. You went outside that night. Why? The butler's face paled, his mouth tightening. For a moment he said nothing. Then he lowered his gaze. I heard them, he said. Voices. I thought it was just another quarrel, but then I saw Mr. Hugh leading her toward the music room. She looked, dazed, unsteady. I followed at a distance. He swallowed hard. When I reached the door, it was too late. She was on the floor. He said she fell. But you didn't believe him, Holmes said. Price's eyes filled with something old and heavy. No, I didn't. Hugh's voice came sharp and cold. You said nothing because you owe me, because I've kept you and this house together. Price turned slowly. I said nothing because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore. The silence that followed was complete. Even the fire seemed to still. Holmes stepped forward once more. We may not have a signed confession, but we now have witness, motive, and lies exposed. Scotland Yard will do the rest. Hugh looked at them all. Lydia, Frederick, Price, Miss Calder, his calm facade cracking at last. You fools, he said softly. You think the law will touch me. I've protected this family for 30 years. You've protected yourself, Lydia said, stepping forward, and destroyed Eleanor to do it. For the first time, Hugh looked shaken. Holmes turned away. The room behind him already changed. The truth is not always clean, he said to me as we stepped into the corridor. But it always finds a place to breathe, once given the chance. And as we passed the staircase where Eleanor once stood, I could almost feel it, to a stillness lifted, a breath released. A bruise, no longer in the wrong place, but remembered rightly at last. Chapter 9. The letter that waited too long. The air in Fernmore House had shifted. It was a subtle transformation, not easily put into words, but one could feel it in the quiet. It was no longer the silence of concealment or dread, but something looser, almost wary-like, a breath held too long finally let go. The morning after the gathering, I woke to find Holmes already dressed, standing by the fireplace with the telegram he had requested the night before. It had arrived shortly after dawn, delivered by a red-faced messenger who left with barely a word. Holmes passed me the page without ceremony. It was a confirmation from the handwriting expert in London, the signature on the amended letter of intent to alter. Mr. Fernmore's will did not match the known samples of the late patriarch. The letter was forged. It was the missing nail Holmes had expected, and now it was in place. We met Lydia at breakfast, her expression drawn but steady. She had barely eaten in days, yet there was an edge to her manner now that spoke of recovery of strength, born from having faced something long unspoken. Holmes shared the results of the telegram with her, gently and without flourish. She received the news with a slow nod, her eyes briefly closing. "I knew," she said, "but it's different hearing it spoken aloud. Proof feels like a kind of justice, doesn't it?" "It's the beginning of it," Holmes replied. "The law will do the rest. Scotland Yard has already been notified. Inspector Bell is en route from Richmond. He will speak to Price, Frederick, and Miss Calder separately. It will not be quick, but it will be done properly." The house felt less burdened as the day unfolded. For the first time since our arrival, sunlight broke through the heavy clouds, casting pale beams across the drawing-room carpet and the wide, frozen garden. Holmes spent the morning walking the grounds alone, while I spoke with Miss Calder in the sitting-room. She was no longer brittle in manner. Her voice, when she spoke of Eleanor, was soft with regret, tinged with something like mourning that had only just been allowed to begin. "She wasn't easy to know," Miss Calder said. "Eleanor lived so much in her own mind, in music and letters. But she had such clarity, such purpose. I think that's what frightened Hugh most, not just what she knew, but how fiercely she believed she was right." I nodded, watching her fingers twist the edge of her handkerchief. "You were fond of her." "Yes," she said quietly. "I let her down." By early afternoon, the inspector had arrived. Bell was a stout, intelligent man with little patience for small talk and a fondness for Holmes' unorthodox methods. After a brief exchange with Holmes in the library, he went about his interviews with quiet efficiency, speaking to each member of the household in turn. Lydia's testimony was brief but clear. Frederick, nervous but earnest. Price spoke with solemn dignity, his voice low and precise. Miss Calder's account, too, matched what she had told Holmes. Bit by bit, the shape of the crime emerged, its timeline drawn, its motives anchored in forgery, greed, and the fear of disgrace. Hugh Fernmore, though he denied all, was summoned to Richmond under police escort. Holmes and I remained at Fernmore House at Lydia's request for one final night. It was a quiet evening, and the household gathered only briefly in the parlor. There was no music, no laughter, just the gentle murmur of voices, as though the very walls had grown tired of echoing lies. Holmes sat apart most of the evening, smoking silently and gazing into the fire. When I asked him if he was satisfied, he gave me a look both contemplative and distant. "Justice is not satisfaction, Watson. It is the restoration of order. And in cases such as this, when harm was done in darkness, order is the only thing we can offer the dead." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the days behind us. Later, just before midnight, Holmes asked Lydia for permission to look once more through Eleanor's personal effects. She led us to her sister's room, a softly lit chamber filled with books, a faint scent of lilac still lingering in the air. The writing desk was neatly arranged, untouched since the day of her death. Holmes opened the drawer and carefully examined each paper, each folded note. Then, at the back of the desk, his fingers brushed something wedged beneath the base, a slim envelope sealed with dark wax, addressed in Eleanor's hand. He opened it in silence, reading quickly, then passed it to me. The letter was a handwritten copy of the message she had sent to her solicitor, challenging the amended will. It detailed her suspicions, named the date Hugh presented the letter, and stated plainly that she believed the signature was a forgery. It was dated 2 days before her death. She made this copy for herself, Holmes said softly, in case something happened. She knew what she was risking. I looked up, and now it joins the record. Her voice, once silenced, will be heard. He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. As we left Eleanor's room, Holmes paused at the doorway and turned one last time to look inside. She saw the trap forming around her, he said, and she tried to leave behind the shape of it. That bruise was not just a mark, Watson. It was the only word she had left when they took her voice. I said nothing, only followed him down the hallway where the snowlight filtered faintly through the leaded windows. That night, for the first time since we arrived, I slept without dreaming. Not because the house had lost its darkness, but because something in it had finally been named Chapter 10. The room without a draft the following morning was still and almost eerily bright. The snow outside gleaming beneath a sky that had shifted at last from gray to pale blue. Fernmore House, so long steeped in shadows and restraint, seemed somehow changed, though nothing had physically altered. The rooms were the same, the carpets still thick with silence, but the atmosphere had thinned. The lies that once hung in the air like dust had settled. Holmes and I took breakfast in the smaller dining room with Lydia, who now moved with a quiet composure that I had not seen in her before. There was no relief in her, nor triumph, only a sense of steadiness, as though she had picked up the broken ends of something and tied them quietly together. Holmes said little, sipping his tea as he gazed through the tall windows at the unmarked lawn, where no new footsteps had disturbed the morning snow. Afterward, Holmes asked to see the west corridor again, and Lydia escorted us to the wing where so many pieces of the mystery had first begun to fall into place. We walked together past the yellow drawing room, past the familiar side window with its sagging curtain and the faint marks on the sill. The corridor, though warmed by the day's sun, still retained the coolness of its secrets. As we passed Eleanor's room, Holmes paused, his eyes resting on the doorframe. There is one detail, he said softly, which has not yet found its proper shape. He turned to Lydia. You mentioned that Eleanor never used the yellow room after her final argument with Hugh. Lydia nodded. That's right. She said it made her uneasy. She stopped going in entirely. Holmes tilted his head slightly. And yet the curtain was drawn. The seat was used, the window latch freshly scratched. His voice fell to a murmur. Someone else used the room, not just to observe, but to wait. He stepped inside the room again, letting the quiet settle around him. I followed and watched as he moved slowly along the edges, fingers trailing the wainscoting. He crouched near the fireplace and studied the floorboards there, then rose and walked to the opposite wall, the one closest to the adjoining chamber that had once belonged to Hugh. Holmes pressed his palm flat against the wallpaper, then withdrew it. There is no draft, he said. No airflow through this part of the corridor. And yet Price mentioned once feeling a strange chill in the early mornings here. A coldness that came and went. I frowned. Perhaps a loose window. Holmes shook his head. No, the cold was not coming from outside. It was seeping through the walls. He turned and examined the baseboard just below the join between the yellow room and Hugh's study. With a swift motion, he pulled a thin knife from his coat and pressed it between two of the boards. There was a soft click, then a narrow panel popped inward with a hiss of released air. Behind it, in the wall, was a small recess empty, save for a single aged key and a folded sheet of paper. Holmes took both carefully and stepped back into the room. He unfolded the page and scanned it quickly, then handed it to me. The note was brief, written in a hurried, almost panicked hand. "If anything happens to me, it will be because of what I know about the will. I left a key to the solicitor's copy in the old chess box. Tell Lydia she believed me." It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. Lydia read the note in silence, her face pale again. "The chess box," she whispered. "She kept it in the cupboard beneath her bed. She used to say it was where she stored secrets." We returned to Eleanor's room immediately. Lydia knelt beside the bed and drew out a small wooden box carved with rooks and pawns, its surface polished with age. Inside, beneath the faded pieces, was a small compartment hidden beneath the sliding base. Within it lay another envelope, sealed but clearly untouched. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a second letter to the solicitor, longer than the previous copy detailing not only Eleanor's suspicions about the forged will, but her belief that Price had seen more than he admitted, and that Hugh had been pressuring her for months in ways that could not be proven through documents alone. Holmes folded the letter and placed it gently back in the box. "This is the last truth she could give," he said. "A letter waiting too long to be read." Lydia closed her eyes and sat on the edge of the bed. "She tried so hard to speak, didn't she? And we kept telling her it would pass, that it was grief, or paranoia, or just stress." Her voice trembled. "We kept asking her to be quiet when what she needed was to be heard." Holmes rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You hear her now. That is what matters." By late afternoon, Inspector Bell had returned to collect the final materials. The newly uncovered letter and key would be forwarded to the solicitor's office in London, where the original estate records could be unlocked and fully examined. Holmes and I stood with Lydia at the threshold as Bell departed, the wheels of the inspector's carriage crunching over the snow-packed lane. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Lydia turned to Holmes. "Will the law be enough?" she asked. "Will it truly reach him?" Holmes looked toward the horizon, where the fading sun dipped behind the winter trees. "It may not reach his conscience," he said, "but it will reach his name. And that, for men like Hugh Fernmore, is often the sharper wound." That evening the house was dim once more, though the weight it carried had shifted. The yellow room was locked. Eleanor's door remained open, and though no one said it aloud, we all understood that the house had become something else, no longer just a place of mourning, but one of memory. Before bed, Holmes paused again by the fireplace and took from his pocket the first letter, the one that spoke only of fear and the bruise in the wrong place. "She left so many signs," he said, "more than most victims ever do. And still the truth almost slipped past us." I nodded slowly. "But you saw it." Holmes looked into the fire. "No," he said. "She made sure we would. I only had to listen." Chapter 11. The witness in the frame. The following day arrived with a strange clearness in the sky. as though even the weather had grown weary of shadows. The snow was beginning to recede, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath the hedgerows and stone walkways. Holmes and I delayed our departure by a few hours at Lydia's request. There remained one final matter, she said, that required our eyes. We found her in the small portrait gallery on the second floor, a narrow corridor lined with somber ancestral paintings, faces rendered in oil and shadow, some with stern expressions, others with eyes turned away from the viewer entirely. It was a part of the house we had not visited before, and there was a chill in the air, though the morning sun streamed weakly through the small windows. Lydia stood before a portrait at the far end, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "This is the one," she said as we approached. "It was painted just before Father died. A family commission. We all sat for it, Uncle Hugh, Frederick, Eleanor, and myself. The canvas was large, set in an ornate gold frame. The setting was the music room, unmistakable. In the background detailed the polished piano, the windows drawn in gauze, the exact curvature of the hearth. Eleanor sat near the center, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression reserved but composed. Lydia stood beside her, smiling faintly. Frederick leaned in from behind, hands tucked in his pockets, and Uncle Hugh, tall and rigid, stood a step apart, his eyes fixed not on the viewer but off to the side, as though distracted by something unseen. Holmes studied the portrait closely, stepping nearer, his eyes moving across each figure, each brushstroke. "Remarkable," he murmured, "not for what it captures, but for what it conceals." He gestured to Eleanor's hands. "Do you see?" I leaned in. "They're not folded." "Not exactly. One hand is clenched." "The right," Holmes nodded, and slightly reddened. "The artist painted what he saw she had bruising even then." Lydia's breath caught. "That would have been months before she died." "She never said." Holmes tilted his head. "She was already hiding something. Or someone was already warning her to keep quiet." He moved next to Hugh's figure, observing the posture, the tension in the painted shoulders. "And here note the angle of his gaze. Most viewers would call it indifferent, but it's not. It's alert. He's watching something just outside the frame." Holmes turned to Lydia. "Do you recall what was beyond the edge of this composition? What was in the room, just off the artist's canvas?" Lydia furrowed her brow, trying to remember. "The doorway to the side hall, and the old wall mirror above the credenza." "Why?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Because what a man sees, he sometimes tries to hide. But a mirror sees both ways, especially one captured in paint." He stepped back and examined the canvas from an angle, then crouched slightly. "There," he said, pointing to the far right edge barely visible, a shimmer in the painted shadow. "The mirror's reflection, and within it a figure. Only the barest suggestion, but unmistakably present." The painter included someone else. Someone who should not have been in the room. I squinted. It was no more than a faint silhouette shape near the door, one hand raised, as if adjusting something on the wall. "Could it be the artist?" I asked. "Unlikely," Holmes said. "The artist would not have needed to appear in the reflection. And yet, this figure is half-formed, as though quickly obscured." Lydia stared at the shape, her face pale. "That's the day Eleanor told me. She thought someone had been following her. She said she heard footsteps in the side hall while we posed." I dismissed it. I told her it was probably one of the servants. Holmes stepped back and nodded slowly. "Then this is more than a family portrait. It's a record of a pattern of presence, always just out of sight." She wasn't imagining things. She was being watched. Possibly even then, the plan was already forming. We stood in silence. The house around us seemed to hum with memory, with old fears now given names. Then Holmes turned and moved toward the stair. "Come, Watson," he said. "There's one last place I wish to revisit before we leave. The cellar." Lydia's eyes widened slightly. "Why the cellar?" "Because that's where secrets are kept when people believe no one will ever look beneath them." The cellar beneath Fernmore House was a low and narrow space, lit by 2 oil lamps and the faint trickle of light from the narrow window wells. The stone walls were damp, and the air smelled of coal and age. Holmes moved slowly through the main chamber, then paused at the far wall where a small storage alcove held rusted trunks and a stack of firewood. He crouched and began tapping gently along the stones. After a minute, one gave a dull echo. He pressed it. The brick shifted slightly inward. Beneath it, tucked in a dry crevice, was a faded cloth pouch. Holmes withdrew it carefully and opened the flap. Inside were 2 items: a brass watch engraved with the initials EF and a small silver pendant. Lydia gasped when she saw them. "Those belonged to Eleanor. She said they vanished weeks before." Holmes nodded. "Stolen, not misplaced. Someone took them, likely to use as leverage to remove reminders of her independence. But when she died, the items became dangerous. So they were hidden, not destroyed." Holmes stood and brushed the dust from his coat. "This is what guilt looks like when it has no plan. It buries the evidence and hopes the earth forgets." He turned to me, and his voice softened. "But earth forgets nothing. It only waits for someone willing to look." We returned to the surface, the final pieces now resting quietly in Holmes's coat pocket. The day had ripened into full light. The trees, heavy with melt, dripped softly along the gravel path as we prepared to leave. Lydia stood with us at the gate, her cloak drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the house she now commanded alone. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next," she said. Holmes offered a faint smile. "Begin again. But let the truth stay where it belongs, out in the open." And with that, we left Fernmore behind, the Bruise no longer in the wrong place, but instead visible to all who chose not to turn away. Chapter 12. The Ink Beneath. The Ashwee returned to London 2 days after departing Fernmore, the train rocking gently beneath us as frost-laced fields blurred past the window. Holmes remained quiet for much of the journey, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed not on the passing scenery, but somewhere inward, where the residue of the case still lingered. I knew better than to press him with questions during such silences. In truth, I too found myself drifting into thought not of the forged will, nor the testimony, nor even of Hugh Fernmore's cold manipulations, but of Eleanor herself. Her presence had remained, somehow, more potent in absence than many of the living figures we had questioned. She had left behind not a scream, but a trail series of fragile, precise clues that had almost been lost to the silence others tried to enforce around her. When we arrived at Baker Street, the city air was wet with mist, and the lamps had already been lit despite the hour being early. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her usual brisk warmth and a stack of letters set aside for Holmes, which he ignored for the moment. He went instead to his writing desk, not to compose notes on the case, as I expected, but to open a drawer from which he retrieved a narrow glass vial, half filled with a viscous black fluid. "India ink," he murmured, uncorking it and examining the texture. "The old kind. Leaves a trace even after burning." I watched him, puzzled. "Is this about the letter Eleanor wrote?" "No," he said. "It's about the one Hugh destroyed. The original. The one we never recovered, but that we may still find evidence of." Holmes rose and gestured for me to follow him into the laboratory adjoining our sitting room. There, under the gas lamp, he placed a charred scrap of paper atop a metal tray and began preparing a solution from a nearby shelf. Price mentioned that Hugh kept a fire going in the study almost every evening, Holmes said. Too convenient, too precise. If a man burns something out of routine, no one thinks twice. But sometimes, in haste, a corner of the truth is left behind. He dipped a brush into the mixture and passed it gently over the scorched fragment. Slowly, the faint imprint of a signature emerged, blotched and ghostly, but unmistakably real. Holmes leaned in. "There," he said. "The letter to Wickham. The one Hugh claimed never existed." I stared at the mark. It wasn't a full page, just a curved line, a flourishing up to identify Eleanor's hand. "And this was found in the study fireplace?" I asked. "Tucked behind the grate," Holmes said. "I asked Lydia to look once more before we left. She sent it by courier this morning." He placed the paper aside and began writing quickly in his notebook. "This fragment proves not only that Hugh lied but that he destroyed something which contradicted his version of events. That, paired with the forged amendment and the testimony of Price and Miss Calder, will be more than enough to seal his fate." Later that evening, Holmes sat beside the fire, the familiar pipe in hand, smoke curling above his head as he reflected aloud. "You know, Watson, there's a curious irony to this case. Most crimes hinge upon what is seen: a knife, a gun, a broken lock. But this one, it hinged entirely on what was missing. A misplaced bruise, a missing letter, a silence stretched too long. Eleanor didn't need to shout for help. She only needed someone to notice what wasn't where it should be." He exhaled slowly, his voice softening. "Most would have walked past her. Most did." I nodded, watching the embers. "But you didn't." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Only because she left a trail even in her retreat. That's the mark of someone who still hoped right to the end that someone might be listening." The days that followed brought news in steady increments. Hugh Fernmore had been formally charged with willful fraud and obstruction. Though the murder charge remained circumstantial, the weight of evidence, both material and testimonial, was considerable. Frederick agreed to testify. Price provided a signed statement. Miss Calder offered her full account, and the solicitor's firm, embarrassed by its earlier oversight, pledged to cooperate fully with the court's inquiry. As for Lydia, she wrote to us a week after our return. Her letter was brief but sincere. The estate, she said, would be divided anew, restoring the original terms her father had intended. She would remain at Fernmore for now, tending to its affairs, though she had opened the house to sunlight and music once again. "I play the piano in the mornings," she wrote. "Not like Eleanor, but enough that it feels like something is being remembered, not mourned. Holmes read the letter and said nothing for a long while. Then he rose, placed it gently on the mantel, and returned to his desk. "I believe," he said, "that Eleanor would have liked that." That evening, as London's fog rolled thick outside our windows, Holmes and I sat once more in the familiar glow of our fire. The case of Eleanor Fernmore had concluded not with applause or drama, but with the slow, solemn stitching of truth back into a place it had nearly been torn from. It was not a case that brought fame, nor one that would ever be widely known, but it was one that lingered. Before retiring, Holmes added a final note to the folder he kept tucked beneath his desk. A simple line scrawled beneath the case title. "Sometimes the bruise is the only voice that cannot be silenced." He closed the file, extinguished the lamp, and as the room faded into darkness, I could not help but feel that something gentle, long unheard, had finally been allowed to speak. Chapter 13. The smudge on the envelope. It was a quiet Thursday morning on Baker Street. The kind that comes with a faint promise of spring, though the city still bore winter's weight. Holmes was in one of his lighter moods, humming softly to himself as he rearranged his chemistry table, placing vials of colored liquid in a precise sequence that only he understood. I had settled into my usual armchair, the newspaper folded across my lap, though I had read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word. The Fernmore case lingered in my thoughts. There had been no dramatic arrest, no courtroom confession, but it had ended as so many true crimes do in paper: signatures, statements, and the quiet consequence of exposure. And yet, I could not help but feel something unfinished still hovered in its edges. That feeling deepened when the post arrived. Mrs. Hudson brought it in herself, clearly curious, as she handed Holmes a stiff brown envelope without return address. The seal bore a crest I did not recognize, 2 lions flanking a tree, and a thin black ribbon had been tied through a punched hole at the corner. Holmes studied it with more interest than usual, running his fingers over the surface. "This," he murmured, "is not casual correspondence." He broke the seal and unfolded the contents. There were only 3 items: a single sheet of parchment, a photograph, and a small scrap of newspaper. Holmes read the note first, eyes flicking across the page. Then he passed it to me without a word. The letter was unsigned. The handwriting was rigid, as though written under pressure or by someone unaccustomed to letters. "There is more to Fernmore than the will. Ask what was left behind in the East Wing." She knew. That's why he couldn't let her speak. She wasn't just challenging his claims, she was protecting someone. Someone no one knew was there. I looked up, heart tightening. "Someone?" I asked. Holmes was already inspecting the photograph, a small sepia-toned print. It depicted the side of Fernmore House, taken from a sharp angle, one that included a portion of the old East Wing, mostly obscured by brambles and shadow. At first glance it appeared ordinary, but Holmes turned it toward the light. There, near the corner of the stone wall, stood a small figure, almost imperceptible. A girl, perhaps no older than 7 or 8, partially hidden behind a column. Her face was turned away, her posture stiff, as though caught watching something she should not have seen. "Good Lord," I breathed. "Is that?" "Unclear," Holmes said. "But it introduces a new possibility, one not addressed by Lydia nor Price, nor anyone we questioned. We never explored the East Wing. It had been closed for years, according to Lydia. She said it was abandoned, I recalled, used for storage, and sealed after the roof collapsed in one of the outer rooms. Holmes tapped the photo. Abandoned by the household, perhaps, but not uninhabited. Someone was there. Possibly someone Eleanor knew. Possibly someone she was shielding. He picked up the final item, the newspaper scrap. It was a small clipping, just a few lines torn from the obituaries. Isabella Gray, aged 10, passed quietly at Fernmore House. No service requested. No family present. Private burial arranged. The date was 3 years prior. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, then set it down beside the photo. Do you remember any mention of a child, Watson? None, I said. Lydia never spoke of a cousin or ward, and Price never hinted at anyone besides the core family. Holmes stood abruptly, which means it was a secret, and secrets of that size leave echoes. We must go back. I blinked in surprise. Return to Fernmore. Yes, Holmes said. We missed something. Eleanor wasn't just trying to preserve a legacy, she was protecting someone's life, and that life may have already ended before we arrived. But if it didn't? If Isabella Gray is more than a name in print, then there is still a truth buried behind the East Wing. By the following morning, we were on the train once more. The countryside rolling past in sullen gray as Holmes pored over old property maps of the estate. Lydia met us at the station with obvious surprise in her eyes, though she asked no immediate questions. We explained the envelope, the letter, and the photograph over tea in the same drawing room, where we had once gathered the household to expose Hugh. Lydia listened in stillness, her face unreadable until the mention of the obituary. Then she paled. Isabella Gray, she whispered. I haven't heard that name in years. My father mentioned her once, said she was the orphaned daughter of a distant cousin. She came to stay at Fernmore briefly after her mother died, but then she vanished. I assumed she had been sent elsewhere. Holmes leaned forward. Do you know if Eleanor knew her? Lydia hesitated. She must have. Eleanor always made it her business to befriend the lost. If Isabella was in the house, Eleanor would have known. We asked Lydia to take us to the East Wing, which had long been left closed. The corridor was colder than the others, the air still and heavy with disuse. The doors were warped from damp, and cobwebs clung like gauze from the corners. We passed rooms filled with broken furniture, boxes of yellowed linens, and shuttered windows that barely filtered in the light. Holmes paused at the end of the hall, where a narrower door stood slightly ajar. He opened it gently. Inside was a small room with faded wallpaper and a narrow child's bed tucked beneath a dust-covered window. A doll lay on its side on the floor, its porcelain face cracked clean down the middle. No one had stepped in this room for a long time, and yet something remained. Holmes crossed to the far wall, where a child's drawings had been tacked, now curling at the edges. The colors faded, but visible. Crude figures, a tall man with no eyes, a woman with red marks on her arms, and, always, a second child standing in shadow, her face always blank. Holmes turned to me. This room was not forgotten. It was hidden. I stepped closer. Then what happened to her? Holmes looked again at the drawing of the eyeless man. That, he said, is what we've come to learn. And in that room, beneath the dust and old wallpaper, the story of Fernmore shifted once more from fraud and silence to something far deeper, a disappearance that had never even been recorded, a life unspoken, a child erased, and a sister who tried, quietly, against all odds, to leave behind a trail in ink and bruises and silence for someone, someday, to finally follow. Chapter 14. The name written in dust. The room at the end of the east wing was quieter than any we had stepped into at Fernmore House. Even the air felt different, drier, untouched, like it had not moved in years. The cracked doll still lay near the bed, its limbs askew, a single button I turned toward the corner. Holmes stood motionless in the center, his sharp gaze moving from wall to floor to ceiling with the same precision he might apply to a crime scene, though nothing here had the blood or violence of murder. And yet something lingered in the stillness, not an absence, but a residue, a whisper of a life unspoken. I found myself staring at the window, where thin grime filtered the daylight to a gray hush. Holmes crouched beside the small desk in the corner, its surface layered with dust so thick that his gloved finger left a long, clean line when he swept it across. There were papers there, at least what remained of them, torn edges, old corners curled like dried leaves, and in the drawer a thin leather book. Holmes opened it slowly, revealing the first page, a child's handwriting in uneven lines. Isabella Gray, age 9. I don't talk to anyone but Eleanor. She says I don't have to. She says I can write it down. He turned another page, then another. Each bore only a few sentences, fragments of thought, sometimes joyful, sometimes frightened. Holmes paused at a passage written in shaky script. He came again last night. I didn't come out. Eleanor said not to. She says I'm safest when I'm invisible. Holmes exhaled softly. She was hiding her, he murmured, in plain sight. Eleanor used the East Wing as a refuge, and no one questioned her. Lydia stood by the door, her hand covering her mouth as she listened. No one ever mentioned her, she said, not even after she left. Holmes looked up. Because someone ensured she was erased. Her presence, her name, even her memory, all of it carefully dismantled. He rose and opened the wardrobe beside the bed. Inside, hanging loosely on a child-sized hanger, was a faded coat with a torn sleeve. In the pocket, a small note folded in quarters. Holmes unfolded it with care. If anything happens to me, Isabella mustn't be left here. Tell Lydia. Tell her to find Mr. Wintle. He knows what was promised. Holmes stared at the words for a long time, then passed the note to Lydia. Her face blanched as she read. Mr. Wintle, she whispered. But he left after Eleanor's death. I haven't heard from him since. Holmes nodded. Then it's time we did. He slipped the note into an envelope and placed it in his coat. He's the last thread between Eleanor and Isabella. If there was a promise, it was likely sworn in fear. And fear makes a man unreliable, but not immune to guilt. We left the East Wing in silence, each of us carrying something heavy we hadn't expected. That evening, Holmes contacted a trusted inquiry agent, dispatching a request to locate Archer Wintle. He had not returned to London as expected, nor to his previous lodgings in Richmond. Instead, after a few days, we learned he had taken temporary residence in a small inn in the countryside near Norwich. Holmes wasted no time. Within 2 days, we were there standing before a modest, whitewashed building tucked between a copse of bare trees and a stream, gone sluggish in winter's grip. Wintle answered his door, looking older, thinner, and less defensive than before. When he saw Holmes, his mouth tightened, but he stepped aside. "I knew you'd come," he said. "Eventually." Holmes entered calmly, removing his gloves. "You ran from something, Mr. Wintle, not the law, but perhaps from the question Eleanor left behind." Wintle sat heavily in a chair near the hearth. He looked into the flames, then spoke without looking up. "I didn't kill her," he said. "I swear that." "I believe you," Holmes said. "But you know who Isabella Gray was? And you know why Eleanor hid her?" Wintle nodded, slowly. "She was Hugh's daughter," he said. "From an affair long ago. The mother died. Hugh wouldn't acknowledge her. Said the family name had no room for accidents. But your Eleanor Shea was different. She took the girl in, convinced your father to let her stay under the pretense of charity. Hugh agreed only because it kept things quiet. But when your father died, everything changed. Hugh wanted her out, said she was a liability." He paused. "Eleanor refused. She moved Isabella to the East Wing and kept her hidden. Even Price didn't know. Just me. I helped her get supplies, books, food. It wasn't much, but we thought it was enough." Lydia was pale, but she stepped forward. "Where did she go?" she asked. "When Eleanor died." Wintle rubbed his face with both hands. "Eleanor had a plan. She'd saved some money, left instructions for me to take Isabella to a friend in Devon. But when she died, I was afraid. Hugh was watching me. I waited too long. By the time I went to fetch Isabella, she was gone." "The room was empty." "Gone?" Holmes asked. "Vanished." Wintle nodded. There was no sign of struggle. Just her coat and the drawing of Eleanor's face on the bed. Holmes turned away, his voice distant. "Then someone else found her first." That night, Holmes and I returned to our rooms in silence. He stared for hours at the corner of his notebook where Isabella's name had been written and underlined. "She may be gone," he said at last, "but I do not believe she is lost." I looked at him, the shadows from the lamp pooling across the floor. "You think she's still alive?" "I think," Holmes said softly, "that some ghosts walk away instead of lingering, but they leave footprints behind." And with that, he turned the page and wrote her name again, this time not as a mystery, but as a vow. Chapter 15. What Price chose not to remember. We remained at Fernmore longer than intended. The air of unfinished truth keeping Holmes rooted to the stone corridors like ivy clinging to an old wall. Lydia made no move to hasten our departure, though her expression had grown quieter with each passing day, as though she too sensed there was something else yet to be unearthed. Holmes spent much of the time in the East Wing, revisiting Isabella's drawings and pacing the chapel with slow, deliberate steps. His thoughts, I could tell, were circling the same unsaid suspicion, a shape just behind the veil, nearly formed but not yet ready to show its face. It was on the third morning after discovering Eleanor's journal that Holmes summoned Price to the study. The butler arrived precisely as expected, his posture correct, though age and fatigue now showed in the lines around his eyes. "Price," Holmes said gently, "I wish to speak plainly, not as an accuser, but as someone following Eleanor's voice. She left more than evidence. She left a memory." And I believe there's something you've been trying not to remember." The man hesitated, one hand tightening slightly against the edge of his coat. "I've told you all I know, Mr. Holmes." "No," Holmes said. "You've told us all you've let yourself believe." He rose and crossed to the fire. "When Eleanor moved Isabella into the East Wing, you suspected. You may not have known at first. But you're a man of the house. You knew when tea was missing, when laundry went unaccounted for, when footsteps echoed down a corridor no one else used." Price's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Holmes continued, quieter now. "Eleanor trusted you. She left your name in the journal twice, once in affection, once in fear. She believed you would protect the child if she could not, and I think you tried, but something stopped you." Price lowered his gaze. The fire flickered, casting a long shadow across the polished floor. "It was the winter," he said at last, his voice hollow. "The winter before she died. I brought Eleanor a parcel late one night. I knocked at her door, but she didn't answer. So I entered. She wasn't there, but I heard movement in the corridor. I followed it, just a glimpse of a child's back disappearing through the yellow drawing room." He exhaled, the memory dragging itself forward like something heavy and reluctant. "I told myself, I imagined it, that perhaps it was one of Miss Lydia's old things being moved, but deep down, I knew. I went to Eleanor the next morning. I asked if she was keeping someone in the closed wing. She looked at me, and her eyes, she didn't lie. She just said, 'Not all family comes by blood.' And then she said, 'If you see a girl with gray eyes, you never saw her at all.'" Holmes said nothing for a time. Then, softly, "Why didn't you tell us this before?" "Because I failed her," Price whispered. "When she died, I should have gone straight to the East Wing. I should have opened every door, but I didn't. I told myself it was over, that the girl had been taken away. I believed the silence because it was easier." Holmes stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder. "It is not too late to help her now." That evening, as we dined simply in the warm hush of the small drawing room, Lydia said very little. Holmes spent most of the meal staring into space, not absent-mindedly, but as though arranging thoughts in layers only he could perceive. Finally, as the fire burned low and the room dimmed to amber, he turned to her and said, "Do you recall if there's ever been construction beneath the chapel? Any repairs, any mention in your father's ledgers?" Lydia frowned. "There was talk of a crypt. My grandfather once said it had been sealed. Something to do with flooding after a storm. The foundation wasn't stable." Holmes stood, suddenly animate. "A sealed vault," he said. "Flood damaged, forgotten, then perhaps not entirely sealed after all." He moved swiftly toward the west corridor, stopping only to gather his lantern and coat. "Watson, with me. There's something beneath us still listening, and I think it's time we knock back." It was then I understood the case had not ended at the will or the lie, or even the bruises. There had always been a deeper silence waiting below the surface, a door locked not by a key but by fear and time, and somewhere beneath Fernmore, the truth was still waiting. Chapter 16: A Knock Beneath the Floorboards. The days that followed passed with a strange quiet, as though the mystery itself had exhaled. And yet Holmes was not at rest. He kept to his desk, deep in thought, fingers drumming lightly on the edge of his chair. The name Isabella Gray had not left his mind, nor had the memory of that child's drawing pinned to the crumbling wall in the east wing a figure with a blank face, always watching. I often found him standing at the window in the early mornings, eyes distant, as if trying to see a shape not yet formed. On one such morning, as the frost clung to the panes and the city clattered faintly below, Holmes turned to me and said, "She left, but she did not vanish. Not completely. Someone helped her. And if we can find the silence between those days, we may hear who it was." We began again, not at first, but in the village nearby, the small place with the church, the general shop, and a scattering of homes where the staff had once lived. We posed our questions carefully. Most remembered Eleanor fondly, if distantly, but when Holmes mentioned the east wing, a few exchanged glances. One elderly woman, the widow of a former gardener, recalled Eleanor arriving quietly at the church late one winter evening, accompanied by a child in a hooded cloak. She asked Father Matheson to bless her, the woman said, and to keep her name from the books. Said the child had no place in the Fernmore records. Holmes pressed gently. "And did the priest do as she asked?" The woman nodded. "He was an odd sort, but kind. He said every soul deserved shelter, even the ones forgotten." We visited the church next, a stone structure hunched against the wind, its roof patched and its graveyard lean with unmarked crosses. Father Matheson, long since passed, had left no diaries, but the records remained, kept now by a young vicar who allowed us to search the archives. Holmes found it, a thin pressed note between 2 pages of the parish log. For the child under her protection, Gray by name, silent by necessity. Do not ask, do not speak, only shelter. It was signed EMF, Eleanor's initials, followed by a date 3 days before her death. Holmes studied the note, then folded it gently. She tried to arrange a place beyond the house, and she must have known she didn't have much time. But someone found out. The vicar confirmed that no child had been taken in officially, but that a week after Eleanor's death, a man came asking about a girl. He claimed to be family, described Isabella perfectly. He wore dark gloves, the vicar added, and didn't give a name. I thought it strange, the way he looked at the chapel walls as if he expected them to lie to him. Back in London, Holmes began reaching out through quieter channels. He contacted orphanage registries, boarding schools, small parishes known for taking in the forgotten. His inquiries were specific, but not alarming. Days passed. Then, one morning, as I returned from my errands, I found Holmes seated stiffly, a letter unfolded on the table beside him. He looked up, and I saw something taut in his face, not triumph, but something closer to disbelief. "She was seen," he said quietly, "in Devon, a house run by a widow who took in children with no surnames. The matron died last year, and the house was sold. But one of the older boys remembered a girl with gray eyes who never spoke. She used to draw constantly faces, rooms, staircases, keys, and once she buried a tin box in the garden." I sat forward. "And he dug it up before the house was sold," Holmes said. "Kept the contents. Said he knew it was important, but didn't understand why. He's sending it now." He tapped the envelope. "There's more. The girl called herself Ella, no surname, but she sometimes signed her drawings with the letter I. 3 days later, the parcel arrived, small tin box, rusted at the hinges, the inside lined with felt. Within it were folded drawings, brittle with age. Some were simple sketches of flowers and trees. Others were more detailed rooms, drawn from memory, including the west corridor of Fernmore and the chapel's narrow altar. But one drawing made Holmes pause. It was a floor plan, not quite to scale, but unmistakably that of a house. A narrow stair, a long corridor, and then, marked with a red wax crayon, a door drawn in the floor itself. Holmes stood slowly. She saw where it happened, he said. Not just the act, but what came after, where something or someone was hidden. I frowned. You believe it was beneath the music room? Not the music room, Holmes said. The room beside it. The one with the rug we never lifted. There was never a reason to, until now. That evening we sent word to Lydia. She replied at once, inviting us back to Fernmore. And so we returned again, under a gray sky and brittle wind, to the house that had given us so much grief and still, somehow, had more to yield. Lydia met us with no surprise-only readiness. The east wing, she said, never truly closed, did it? Holmes shook his head. Only in name, and only long enough for something to be hidden. By candlelight, we entered the forgotten room now, stripped of its furniture, its wallpaper peeling. In the center, the rug remained. Holmes knelt and pulled it back. The floorboards beneath were uneven. One bore a scratch across the grain. With care, he slipped a flat knife beneath it and pried it upward. The wood groaned, but gave way, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. And there, at the bottom, wrapped in linen and tied with twine, was a small bundle. Holmes opened it with silent hands. Inside was a book, Lenore's journal, and within its final pages, written in rushed, slanted ink, "If I am gone, she may still be found. I've left enough for the right eyes to see. For the child not born of my blood, but still mine. Protect her. She knows where the truth lives. She is the truth." And in that final light, we understood. Isabella Gray had not vanished. She had survived. And Eleanor had given everything she had to leave behind the map of her escape, not just through evidence, but through memory and through ink. Holmes closed the journal slowly. She never raised her voice, he said, but she wrote louder than anyone could scream. Chapter 17, The Girl in the Lantern Light. Was just past midnight when Holmes and I sat in the library at Fernmore once more. Eleanor's journal spread open across the table between us. The room was warm from the fire, but the air still carried the coldness of something long buried, now breaking surface. Lydia had gone to rest, though I doubted she would sleep. The discovery of the journal of Eleanor's final voice had shaken her to her core. It had done something similar to me, though I found myself unable to name it. In that fragile handwriting, in those final pages, Eleanor had not only named the child, but passed her into the hands of anyone willing to see her not with grand declarations, but with quiet, deliberate clues. Holmes sat reading in near silence, his fingers occasionally pausing to underline a sentence with the side of his thumb. His face bore a rare expression of reverence, not for the mystery, but for the mind behind it. Eventually, he spoke. Eleanor left this not as a conclusion, but as a trail. She knew someone would come after, and she trusted that person would know how to listen. He turned the page gently. She recorded everything in fragments, Watson. The visits, the warnings, the moments she feared Hugh had guessed. But this passage, here listen, he read aloud, softly. She started drawing staircases again. Not the ones in the house, but the one below the chapel. I asked her why. She said she heard something knocking, like someone calling her from underneath. I stared at him. Below the chapel. Holmes nodded. There's no known access beneath it. But chapels built in that era often had crypts or storage vaults beneath. And if Eleanor knew that she might have used it, I finished, as a place to hide Isabella when she feared Hugh was close. By first light, we stood before the chapel doors once more. Lydia unlocked them without speaking, and Holmes lit a lantern against the dimness within. The stone floor echoed beneath our feet as we moved toward the altar. Holmes circled its base slowly, examining the floor, the corners, the paneling behind the lectern. Finally, he knelt near the eastern wall and tapped a section of stone. A faint, hollow reply met the sound. He pressed his palm flat. "Here," he said. "Feel the temperature cooler than the surrounding floor." With great care, he slid a blade beneath the lip of one of the flagstones. It resisted at first, then tilted upward with a soft scrape. Beneath it, dark space. Holmes held the lantern low. Steps descended into silence, narrow and worn with age. We moved down slowly, Lydia behind us, her breath tight and quick. The vault below was smaller than expected, a low-ceilinged chamber with walls lined in stone and the scent of earth and old damp. Shelves lined one wall, bare but for a few rusted tools and candle stubs. But what drew our attention was the corner where a makeshift cot remained nothing more than blankets laid over stone, but shaped by recent use. Holmes lowered the lantern. On the cot rested a drawing. It was a Fernmore house, viewed from the chapel window. A tall man stood by the stair, a woman beside a piano, and a child always at the edge, her eyes drawn open wide. The signature in the corner was a single letter I. "She's been here," Lydia whispered. "Even after all this time," Holmes nodded. "And likely not long ago. The dust is disturbed, the blanket warm. But where is she now?" I asked. "Gone again." Holmes stared at the far wall. "Perhaps not far. She may return. Children who live in hiding learn to move in patterns, returning to places they consider safe. This vault was hers, and Eleanor's care may have taught her to come back when it's quiet." We left the drawing untouched. Holmes closed the flagstone gently and stood. "We'll leave the chapel door unlatched tonight. No police, no voices, just stillness. If she is watching, and I believe she is, she may come again." That evening, we remained near the windows of the drawing room, the lamps dimmed, the silence heavy. Outside, the chapel stood quiet in the falling dusk, its windows faintly aglow from a single candle left burning inside. We waited in silence for what felt like hours. The wind passed along the hedges. The snow crackled faintly as it thawed. Then, just past midnight, Holmes touched my arm. "There," he said, barely breathing. A figure moved at the edge of the chapel, a small shape, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large. She paused at the door, looked once toward the house, then slipped inside. Holmes did not rise. He only nodded. "Let her be." I swallowed. "Shouldn't we? Not tonight," Holmes said. "Tonight, she has come home." We returned the next morning. The cot was empty, but a new drawing had been left in its place. It showed the chapel from the inside. The three of us, seated beside the cot, a lantern, a book, and the words written beneath in blocky, careful letters. You listened. Holmes took the drawing, folded it neatly, and placed it inside Eleanor's journal. Then he turned to Lydia. She come and go as she must, but now she knows she is not forgotten, and that, sometimes, is enough to change a life. Lydia said nothing, but her eyes glistened. We left Fernmore that afternoon. The frost was melting into earth again, and the snow along the lane had thinned to patches. As our carriage pulled away, I looked back at the chapellet's door, still slightly ajar, the window dim but not dark. A girl might be watching, or she might already be gone again. But she had been seen, she had been believed. And as Holmes leaned back in his seat beside me, he said only this: some cases are not solved with arrests, Watson. Some are solved when someone finds their way back through silence and is allowed to stay. Chapter 18. The Case That Left Its Shadow. We returned to Baker Street under a sky pale with cloud. The streets of London humming with their usual rhythm carts rattling along the cobbles. Boot heels striking sharp, distant whistles, rising and falling like questions unanswered. Yet in Holmes's stride there was none of the sharp momentum he typically carried after a case concluded. He moved more slowly, thoughtfully, as though the weight of the last 2 weeks still clung to the hem of his coat. We said little on the journey. There was no villain in chains, no courtroom spectacle, no headlines calling out Holmes's name. But something had shifted in both of us, in quiet, irretrievable ways. That evening, I found Holmes in the sitting room, standing by the hearth, Eleanor's journal in his hand. He had placed the drawing, the one left behind in the chapel, beneath the cover, folded carefully against her final pages. The fire crackled low, and the soft light played across his face, catching lines I had not noticed before. "Do you think she'll be all right?" I asked, taking my seat near the armchair. He didn't answer immediately. "She survived more than most children ever should," he said at last. "And yet she left something behind. A drawing, a word. You listened. That means she still hopes. And if a child can carry hope after such darkness, Watson, then yes, I think she may yet be all right." The next day, Holmes composed a brief letter to the authorities in Devon, requesting that the property which once housed the children under the widow's care be surveyed again, not for evidence, but for oversight. He included Eleanor's journal entries, Isabella's drawings, and the record from the church, not to accuse, but to place truth gently back into the hands of the system that had once failed to see her. "We give them the road," he said as he sealed the envelope. "Whether they walk it is another matter." In the weeks that followed, the case faded from external attention, but not from Holmes's mind. I noticed it in the way he turned to the fire with more frequency, or how often his fingers drifted across the spine of Eleanor's journal when passing the shelf. Some mysteries resolve with clarity, suspects revealed, timelines closed, motives laid bare. But the Fernmore case had not ended that way. It had narrowed to a point beyond deduction. It had become about something Holmes rarely acknowledged: protection, not punishment; memory, not retribution. Lydia wrote once more, her letter longer than before. She spoke of repairs being done on the chapel roof, of music returning to the west drawing-room, of Miss Calder now assisting her with estate correspondence. Frederick had moved to London, seeking distance from the place that had once held him in silence. And Price, still loyal, had taken up a quieter post, one with less shadow and fewer locked doors. Lydia's last lines, however, stayed with us both. "Last night I heard someone moving through the east corridor. No footsteps, just the creak of old floorboards. When I looked, no one was there. But on the windowsill was a stone, shaped like a heart, warm from a palm. I did not touch it. I left it where it was. Sometimes I think silence is not absence. It's a way of saying I am still here." Holmes read that part twice, then folded the letter and tucked it into the journal without a word. That night, as the lamps flickered and Baker Street turned quiet around us, I asked Holmes if he considered this one of our successes. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, then walked to the fireplace and stirred the coals. "I consider it one of our responsibilities," he said. "There are crimes, Watson, that demand a solution, and then there are tragedies that ask only to be witnessed. Fernmore was both, and Eleanor," he paused, "Eleanor knew how to leave a trail not of proof, but of meaning. That is rarer than any deduction." He sat down, lit his pipe, and the smoke curled up into the stillness. Outside, the city pulsed on, unaware that a child had survived by silence, and a sister had spoken through bruises and paper and shadows. But we knew, and we would not forget. In my notes, I did not title the case "The Bruise in the Wrong Place," though that was how it began. I called it instead "The Voice Eleanor Left Behind," for that was how Holmes treated it, not as a crime solved, but as a message received. And some nights, as the fire fades and the rain taps against the windows, I think of that chapel window left slightly open, of a drawing placed gently on a cot, and of a voice, small and steady, that whispered through every clue, "You listened." We followed Holmes into the dim corridor, our footsteps soft on the stone, the hush around us broken only by the low creak of the house settling into night. I carried a second lantern, its glow trembling along the walls, like breath on glass. Holmes paused once beneath the arched window near the chapel, his eyes narrowing as though listening to something we could not yet hear. "She marked the way, Watson," he said, almost to himself, "not with ink this time, but with memory and fear and a child's quiet steps." Then he turned, and we descended into silence once more.